The sun sat heavy in the sky, not blazing in the way a midday sun does, but burning with a steady, merciless weight that seemed to press everything flat. The air shimmered above the cracked earth, twisting the horizon into wavering shapes that could have been heat mirages or ghosts, depending on how long you'd been riding. Rafe squinted from beneath the brim of his hat, the leather sweat-stained and curling at the edges from years of hard travel. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, and the dull ache in his shoulders was starting to creep down into his arms. He was tired, bone-deep tired, but the kind of tired that didn't matter much anymore. He was used to it. His horse, a rangy sorrel named Brim, plodded forward with a resigned rhythm, hooves kicking up puffs of reddish dust that hung in the air before settling back down like slow snow. The smell of dry sage and dust filled Rafe's nostrils. Out here, in this empty stretch between towns, there was nothing to see but low scrub, a few scattered rocks, and the faint track of wagon wheels carved into the earth ahead of him. That track was what kept him going. Up ahead, maybe half a mile or so, a wagon rolled along, the sun glinting off its curved frame. The canvas was a pale tan, stretched tight over wooden ribs. From this distance, the figure driving it was nothing more than a silhouette, a lone rider holding the reins with slow, deliberate movements. Rafe could see no other travelers, no escort, no second wagon. Just one wagon, moving steady and easy like whoever drove it wasn't in any kind of hurry. Rafe's mouth tightened. That was rare out here. No one traveled alone unless they were desperate, foolish, or dangerous in their own right. And yet, the way this wagon drifted over the track didn't speak of danger. It looked almost careless, like a moving target waiting for someone to notice. He noticed. His stomach gave a low, hollow twist, reminding him he hadn't eaten in 2 days. The last of his jerky had been gnawed to a tasteless scrap last night, and his canteen sloshed with maybe 2 mouthfuls of water. He didn't have coin for the next town, not after losing most of what he'd taken in a poker game gone wrong. That was the trouble with running. There was always something else chasing you, and sometimes it wasn't the law, but hunger. Rafe shifted in the saddle, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. The weight of the Colt was familiar, grounding. He wasn't proud of what he was thinking, but he wasn't a man with the luxury of pride anymore. Pride didn't buy you bread. Pride didn't keep you breathing when the sheriff's men were on your tail. He'd done worse than robbing a wagon before. Still, something about the sight ahead nagged at him. The driver was small, slender shoulders under a long veil that fluttered faintly in the breeze. Veils were rare this far west. They weren't for dust so much as for modesty, and modesty was a thing left behind with church doors and polite society. Whoever this was, she wasn't dressed for the trail like a seasoned trader or cattleman's wife. That meant she might not be ready for trouble, which meant she might be carrying something worth taking. Rafe eased Brim into a faster trot, the leather of the saddle creaking beneath him. As the gap closed, details came into sharper view. The way the wagon's wheels wobbled slightly on uneven ground, the sway of the lantern hook at the rear, the faint glimmer of a copper kettle tied down with rope. Domestic things that could be traded or sold for enough to buy him a few days of food and a safe bed. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest sound of wagon wheels groaning against their axles. No whip cracked, no mule driver shouted. Just the slow, steady clop of hooves and the rhythmic squeal of wood against wood. Rafe set his jaw. The decision was made before he even realized he'd made it. He nudged Brim forward into a lope, dust streaming out behind them. The wagon ahead didn't pick up speed, didn't swerve. Either the driver hadn't noticed him yet, or she didn't care. In Rafe's experience, people who didn't care were the easiest marks, until they weren't. The sun blazed higher, shadows shrinking away until they clung only to the undersides of wheels and the folds of canvas. Rafe's pulse picked up, his eyes fixed on the back of that wagon. In a few more minutes, he'd be close enough to hail the driver, close enough to level the Colt and make his demands. The dusty road stretched between them like a fuse burning slow toward an explosion, and somewhere deep inside, under the hunger, under the desperation, a part of Ray felt the faintest, strangest whisper of unease, but he ignored it, for now, Rafe had learned long ago that desperation didn't arrive all at once. It came in stages. First came the little inconveniences of shorter meal here, a skipped shave there, a few more nights sleeping under the stars instead of under a roof. Then it edged in closer, tugging at you, your boots wearing thin, your horse growing ribby, your stomach growling more often than it stayed quiet. Eventually, it took root in your bones until every thought, every decision was filtered through the same hard truth: you have to get what you need, or you die without it. He'd been living in that final stage for months now. The law had been after him since spring, when a job in Silver Bend turned bloody. He told himself it wasn't his fault he hadn't pulled the trigger first, but the sheriff wasn't inclined to split hairs over details. Since then, every town had been a gamble. Was this the place he could rest, or the place he'd be recognized? He was running out of both money and luck. The last of his coin had vanished in a smoky saloon in Red Hollow, where a card game had turned against him. He'd been sure he had the winning hand right up until the other fellow laid his cards down with a smile that told Rafe he'd been played from the start. That smile still burned in his mind, more than the loss of the money itself. But pride didn't fill your belly, and right now, the hollow ache inside him was louder than any wounded ego. His horse Brim was starting to suffer too. The animal's ribs were showing more than Rafe liked to admit, and the way the geldings head drooped between strides told him that both of them were running on nothing but stubbornness. Stubbornness would only get you so far, and so, when he'd spotted the wagon up ahead on this lonely stretch of road he hadn't thought should. He thought, can I take it quick and clean? Can I get away before anyone notices? The odds were good. Too good to ignore. He kept his eyes fixed on the wagon as he rode, his mind working over the possibilities. Maybe it carried food, or a stash of coin hidden under sacks of flour. Maybe there'd be blankets, tools, things worth trading. He wasn't picky anymore. He'd take whatever he could carry and leave the rest. Still, some part of him, a part that still clung to a few stubborn shreds of decency, hoped he wouldn't have to hurt anyone to get it. He'd spilled blood before, but it had a way of following you in the dark. Rafe pulled the revolver from its holster, spinning the cylinder absently before sliding it back into place. Just the weight of it against his thigh made him feel more certain. The Colt was his last true possession, his only constant since before he'd gone bad. He'd carried it through saloons, poker tables, back alley deals, and too many gunfights to count. It had been pointed at more men than he cared to remember. Today it might be pointed at just one. The wagon was closer now. He could see the mules. Ears flick back and forth, hear the faint creak of leather harness straps. The driver's veil fluttered in the light wind, pale against the dust-brown road. Rafe frowned. That veil was still nagging at him. It wasn't something you saw on traders or homesteaders. Most folks out here cared more about keeping the sun off their neck than their face. The only people he'd seen wearing one in recent years were women. From far-off towns, clinging to old traditions, or people hiding something. He told himself it didn't matter. All that mattered was that the wagon was alone. He felt the weight of his situation press harder on him with each hoofbeat. If he rode past without taking his chance, he might go another day too, maybe before hunger forced his hand. By then, he might not have the strength to make a move. Out here, hesitation was just another way to die slow. He angled Brim slightly, setting himself on a path that would cut the wagon off up ahead. His shadow stretched long and thin across the dirt, reaching toward the wagon like it could grab hold before he even got there. "Just a quick stop," he muttered to himself. "Quick and clean." The words didn't sound convincing even to his own ears. As the gap between them narrowed to less than 50 yards. Rafe's heartbeat picked up, not in fear exactly, but in that strange, heightened way it always did before. Trouble. He wasn't afraid of trouble. Trouble was where he'd lived for years. But today, it wasn't just trouble waiting for him on that wagon road, and somewhere deep down, though he didn't yet know why, his gut was starting to whisper that robbing this wagon might change his life in a way no sheriff's bullet ever could. The wagon loomed larger now, close enough that Rafe could pick out the faded lettering on its side, once proud, now sun-bleached to the point of unreadability. The wood was cracked in places, patched clumsily with tin. The mules pulling it looked tired but steady, their ears twitching more at flies than at the sound of Brim's hooves pounding closer. Rafe slowed, his pace just enough to keep from startling the team too soon. The last thing he needed was a runaway wagon. Those were harder to stop than a man on foot and twice as unpredictable. He'd learned that the hard way in a mining camp 2 years back, when a simple hold-up had turned into a 3-mile chase through cactus and gullies. This time, he'd do it smart. The driver didn't seem to notice him, or if she did, she gave no sign. She sat upright, hands steady on the reins, the long pale veil draped over her hat fluttering lazily in the wind. Beneath it, her form was slight, shoulders narrow but posture straight. Rafe's eyes narrowed. He'd dealt with plenty of folks on the trail. Most kept glancing over their shoulder at the first sign of another rider, especially one coming in fast. But this one, she was either deaf, oblivious, or simply unafraid. That last possibility gave him pause. People who weren't afraid often had good reason for it. He adjusted the brim of his hat, lowering it to shade his eyes. His fingers flexed on the reins, then drifted toward the butt of his revolver. It wasn't time to draw yet, not until he had her full attention. The road here was narrow, winding between low ridges of dry earth and clumps of brittle brush. Rafe urged Brim into a controlled lope, swinging out wide so he could come up alongside the wagon rather than straight at it. That way, he could block her path without spooking the mules into a dead run. When he was 10 yards off, he called out, not loud enough to scare, just enough to announce himself. "Ho there!" No response. He tried again, louder this time. "Driver." The veil shifted slightly, as though she'd tilted her head. Still, she didn't slow. The mules plodded on, steady and stubborn. Irritation prickled the back of Rafe's neck. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not when he had a Colt on his hip and the intent to use it. He urged Brim forward until he was riding level with the wagon's front wheel. From here, he could see her profile through the thin fabric. Of the veil, a pale outline of a face, the curve of a jaw, the suggestion of eyes watching the road ahead. "You hear me, lady?" he said, his voice hardening. She still didn't answer. Just a small shift of her hands on the reins. That did it. Rafe gave Brim a sharp nudge, pulling ahead so he could angle across the path. The mules balked as he cut them off, their ears pinning back, hooves grinding into the dirt. The wagon creaked to a halt, the harness leather groaning under the sudden stop. Dust swirled up between them, carrying the dry, bitter smell of the road. Rafe sat there in the haze, revolver drawn now and held low but ready. "All right," he said, voice even but cold. "You've had your chance to be polite. Now you're going to hand over whatever you got, food, water, coin, I don't care what. Step down from there nice and slow." For the first time, the driver moved. She turned her head toward him, her gaze hidden behind the veil, and sat there for a moment too long, just staring. It made Rafe uneasy. There was something about the stillness of it, the quiet. No argument, no pleading, no curses. Just a silent regard, as if she were weighing him. He tightened his grip on the Colt. "Don't make this hard," he said. Instead of speaking, she raised a hand, slow, deliberate, and reached up to the edge of the veil. Rafe's pulse kicked. He wasn't sure why, but something in the movement felt like the drawing back of a curtain in a darkened room. Right before you find out what's been standing there all along. The veil began to lift. The air between them felt brittle, like the space before a storm when every sound is too sharp, every shadow too still. Rafe sat high in the saddle, revolver held low but ready, his eyes locked on the veiled figure. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't flinched, hadn't even tried to grab the reins and turn the mules around. That kind of calm didn't belong on a lonely stretch of road, not with a stranger pointing a gun at you. He'd seen plenty of people in this position before. Most begged. Some lied, a few cursed him to hell and back. But silence? Silence meant either fear so deep it froze the tongue, or a kind of self-possession that could turn dangerous. The mule stood stock still, ears twitching toward the occasional rattle of dry brush in the wind. Dust hung in the air between wagon and rider, softening the edges of everything, but not enough to hide the way her head tilted slightly, just enough to let him know she was looking at him, straight through that gauzy veil. "Go on, Rafe," said, voice rough. "Step down from there. Keep your hands where I can see 'em." Nothing. He clicked the hammer back on the Colt, an unmistakable sound that usually worked faster than words. "Lady, I ain't gonna tell you again." Still she didn't move. That prickle of unease he'd felt earlier crawled higher up his spine. He shifted in the saddle, trying to keep his expression fixed and hard, but inside he could feel it, sense that something was off. Not wrong in the ordinary way, but wrong in a way you couldn't quite put a name to. "Look," he tried again, a little sharper, "I don't want trouble. Just hand over what you've got and you can keep rolling." Finally. She moved, not climbing down, not reaching for a purse or satchel. Instead, she raised one gloved hand, slow and deliberate, to the edge of the veil. Rafe's grip on the revolver tightened. Something about the movement made his heart give a heavy, uneven thump. He couldn't explain why. She paused with her fingers, resting lightly at her cheek, as though giving him a chance to stop her. The wind teased at the fabric, lifting it just enough to hint at the shape beneath a pale jawline, the curve of lips that didn't smile or frown. The world seemed to narrow down to that small space between her hand and her face. Rafe realized. He was holding his breath. "Lady," he began, but the word came out softer than he intended. And then, in one smooth motion, she pulled the veil back. The sunlight caught her features, casting them in sharp relief against the shadow of her hat brim. For a moment, Rafe's mind didn't connect what his eyes were seeing. He'd been ready for almost anything: scars, age, beauty, or plainness. But not this. Her eyes. The color hit him first, a shade he'd only ever seen in one other place. His own reflection. The face beneath the veil was older than the last time he'd seen it, harder in some ways, but the bone structure, the set of the mouth, the small scar along the brow. There was no mistaking it. Rafe's gun arm slackened, the Colt dipping toward the dirt. He stared, his breath caught somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. "Anna?" Her lips parted, but for a second she didn't speak. When she did, her voice was steady, but threaded through with disbelief. "Rafe." The sound of his name in her voice nearly undid him. The years between them vanished in an instant, replaced by the memory of a dusty yard, children's laughter, the feel of her small hand clutching his as they ran toward supper. But that was before the night the raiders came, before she'd vanished and he'd been left with nothing but a grave that had no body in it. Now here she was, sitting in a battered wagon on a road in the middle of nowhere, looking at him like she'd stepped out of a dream or a ghost story. The gun felt heavy in his hand, wrong. Slowly, almost without realizing it, he holstered it. Anna's gaze didn't waver. "I thought you were dead," she said. He swallowed hard. "Guess we were both wrong." The mule shifted, impatient with the standstill, but neither sibling moved to end it. The road stretched on behind and ahead, but for Rafe, it felt like the world had shrunk to this single moment. The standoff was over. But something much bigger had just begun. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The veil, now bunched in Anna's gloved hand, fluttered lightly in the wind as though mocking the stillness between them. Rafe just stared. His mind wouldn't catch up. He'd been ready for a stranger ready to snarl commands, ready to take what he needed and ride off without looking back. But not for this. Not for her. The last time he'd seen Anna, she'd been barely 15, hair in braids. Stubborn chin lifted as she insisted she wasn't afraid of the dark. That night, the night he'd told her to stay in the loft while he went to check on the shouting outside. The next thing he remembered was firelight, chaos, the thundering of hooves, and her voice screaming his name before it was swallowed by the noise. For years afterward, he'd carried the certainty that she was gone, dead. The raiders had taken everything else. Why not her? A preacher in Dry Creek had even led a service for her and the others who'd never been found. He'd stood there, hat in hand, swallowing the grief like it was something that could be kept down. And yet here she was, older, yes. Her hair, what he could see of it, was pulled back darker now, maybe from dust and sun. The softness in her face had sharpened into something resilient. Her eyes, though, those hadn't changed. They still had that same impossible shade, somewhere between green and amber, and still looked at him with the quiet intensity that could see past whatever mask he tried to wear. She didn't cry, didn't smile, just looked. Finally, she spoke. "You were going to rob me." It wasn't an accusation, not exactly. More like a simple acknowledgement of the fact. Rafe's mouth opened, but no words came. He wasn't sure what to say. "Didn't know it was you," sounded pathetic. "I wouldn't have if I'd known," sounded worse. Both were true, but neither seemed like enough. He settled for the truth, stripped bare. "I thought you were dead." Her gaze didn't waver. "I thought you were." The wind picked up, tugging at the veil still clutched in her hand. Somewhere off in the scrub, a hawk cried, the sound thin and far away. Rafe shifted in the saddle. Every instinct told him to move, to do something, check the road, scan the ridges, keep from sitting in one place too long. But his body wouldn't obey. It was as if his boots had been nailed to the stirrups. "I looked for you," he said, the words coming rough and low. "For months, He stopped himself. No sense telling her how that search had ended with him cold, broke, and hunted, sliding into the life of a man he never planned to be. Anna tilted her head slightly. "And then you stopped." He winced. It wasn't a question. "I had to survive," he muttered. "Couldn't do much good dead." Something flickered in her expression, maybe understanding, maybe disappointment. Then she glanced at the Colt on his hip, the one he'd nearly pointed at her not 5 minutes ago. "This is surviving?" she asked quietly. The question cut deep. He could have lied. He could have said yes. Could have claimed that you had to do what you had to do in the world they lived in. But the truth was heavier than the lie, and somehow, with her eyes on him, he couldn't lift it. "No," he admitted. Silence fell again, but this time it felt different, not brittle. But waited. Anna looked at him for another long beat, then slowly draped the veil back over her face, not to hide, but almost as if to mark the end of that moment. She gave the reins a gentle shake, and the mule shifted restlessly, ready to move on. Rafe could have let her go. Could have turned brim around, ridden off, and pretended he'd seen a ghost in the desert heat. That would have been the easy thing, the safe thing. Instead, he found himself saying, "Where are you headed?" She studied him again, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read whether the question came from curiosity or something deeper. "North," she said at last. "There's a settlement 2 days from here. People I can trust." The words sat between them like a challenge. Rafe felt something shift inside him, not a sudden change, but the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself over the years. He didn't know what it meant yet. Only that, for the first time. In a long time, his next move wasn't just about himself. The road was empty ahead, a pale ribbon twisting toward the horizon. But to Rafe, it didn't look like the desert anymore. It looked like memory. Anna's face, older, sharper, and impossibly real, was burned into his vision. He could still see the moment the veil came away, still feel the strange kick in his chest when he recognized her. It wasn't the jolt of a bullet or the surge of a fight. It was something slower, heavier, more dangerous. Shock. It left him hollow and full at the same time. He'd spent so long telling himself she was gone, building a life or something like it on the ashes of that certainty. He'd hardened himself against hope because hope had a way of turning into a blade you held against your own ribs. Now here she was, proving that everything he'd believed for years was wrong. And with that truth came another: he'd been about to rob her. His own blood. The thought churned in his gut. He wasn't a man who lost sleep over strangers, but the image of Anna's eyes behind that veil watching him with calm she didn't know him wouldn't let go. His mind dragged him back to the night he'd lost her. The sound of horses screaming, the smell of burning wood, the frantic search through the smoke-choked yard. He'd been 17 and full of the idea that he could protect her from anything. But when the dust cleared, she was gone. For months, he'd hunted for signs, asking in towns, checking graves, tracking rumors. At first, the search had been fire in his blood. Then it had been a slow bleed, draining him until there was nothing left but bitterness. That bitterness had led him here. He glanced at her in the wagon. She sat straight-backed, veil pulled down again, as if the reveal had been a moment she was done with now. He couldn't read her through the fabric, but he could feel her presence like a weight in the air. The strangest thing was that she didn't seem angry. He'd expected outrage, maybe fear, but she'd looked at him like she'd been expecting him, like this meeting was inevitable. Though she hadn't known how or when it would happen, that unsettled him almost as much as the recognition itself. Bryn's hooves clopped in slow rhythm as Rafe rode beside the wagon now, not close enough to crowd it, but not far enough to lose her. He told himself it was just to make sure she didn't run into trouble. Mule teams were slow, and this stretch of road had its share of desperate men. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He needed time. Time to figure out what she'd been doing all these years, how she'd survived, why she'd never sent word. And maybe, though the thought made him uncomfortable, time to figure out if she could ever forgive him for letting her slip away in the first place. The silence between them stretched. The wind stirred up small devils of dust in the distance, spinning them across the road before letting them fall apart again. Somewhere overhead, a hawk circled, its shadow sliding over them for a moment before drifting away. Rafe tried to think of something to say, something that would make the weight in his chest ease up. But every word felt too small for what stood between them. Finally, he muttered, "If I'd known it was you," and let the sentence die. Anna didn't answer. He thought maybe she hadn't heard. But after a moment, she said, "If you'd known it was me, you'd still be the same man who rode up here planning to take what wasn't his." The words hit harder than a bullet. Not shouted, not cruel, just true. Rafe swallowed against the dry lump in his throat. She wasn't wrong. He couldn't undo the last 10 years, couldn't pretend he hadn't become someone who lived off the losses of others. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, he wanted to try, not for himself. For her. The wagon jolted over a rut, snapping him out of his thoughts. The mules kept moving, steady as ever. Rafe realized then that he wouldn't ride away from her. Not today. Maybe not for a long while. Shock was supposed to fade, to dull into something you could carry. But this didn't feel like something that would fade. It felt like the start of something that might change the direction of his life entirely, and he wasn't sure whether that scared him or gave him hope. The road narrowed into a shallow pass, the ridges on either side rising just enough to trap the heat. The air grew heavier, quieter, as though the world itself was leaning in to listen. Rafe kept Brim close to the wagon now, the steady rhythm of hooves and wheels falling into a kind of uneasy harmony. He caught himself glancing toward Anna every few moments, like if he looked away too long she might vanish again the way she had years ago. He didn't know how to start. Too many questions crowded his mind, and all of them felt too big for the space between one hoofbeat and the next dot. It was Anna who broke the silence. "Where have you been all this time?" Her voice wasn't accusing, but it wasn't warm either. It was careful, the way you'd handle a wild animal you weren't sure wouldn't bite. Rafe let out a dry breath, part laugh, part sigh. Everywhere. Nowhere. Drifted from one job to the next, some of them legal. She didn't react, and he didn't push the joke further. "And you?" he asked. She adjusted the reins, eyes on the road ahead. "After the raid, they took me north. I got away. After 2 days." Rafe felt his stomach knot at the thought of what those 2 days might have held. But he didn't ask. "Not yet. I walked until I couldn't. Found a couple headed east, looking for help with their ranch. Stayed with them for a while. Learned how to work mules, fix wheels, tend stock." Her hands shifted on the leather straps, muscle memory guiding them. "When they died, I kept the wagon. Been moving ever since." The simplicity of it hit him harder than if she'd described it as a dozen tragedies. 10 years of surviving, condensed into a few spare sentences. He cleared his throat. "You never sent word." "Not to me, not to anyone." Anna glanced at him, her eyes sharp under the brim of her hat. "I didn't know if you were alive." "Didn't know if I wanted you to be." The words landed like a gut punch. Rafe's fingers tightened around the reins. "Guess I earned that." She looked away again, the veil shifting slightly with her breath. "You left." "I didn't leave," he said quickly. "I went after you. For months. He stopped, forcing his voice back down. "I lost your trail. Or you stopped looking." He wanted to argue, to tell her about the dead ends, the fights, the long nights wondering if he was chasing a shadow. But she wasn't wrong, not really. At some point he had stopped. Not because he didn't care, but because the trail had led him somewhere colder. The realization that he might not survive if he didn't turn. His attention to himself. Anna's voice softened, but only slightly. "And then you became this." She gestured vaguely toward the revolver at his hip. "Yeah," Rafe said. "Guess I did." They rode in silence for a while. The road straightened, the ridges falling away to reveal open land stretching toward the horizon. A light breeze stirred, carrying with it the smell of dry grass. Finally, Rafe said, "You know, I didn't recognize you at first, not just 'cause of the veil. You carry yourself different now, like you've got your feet planted, even when you're moving." Anna's lips twitched, almost but not quite a smile. "And you look older, harder." "Hard'll do that to a man," he said. This time she did smile briefly, faintly. It was gone almost before it came, but it was enough to loosen something in his chest. "That day on the wagon," she began, then paused. "When you came up behind me, I didn't know it was you. Not until you were close enough for me to see your eyes through the dust." Rafe blinked. "My eyes?" "They're the same," she said simply. "Everything else about you's changed. But your eyes haven't." For reasons he couldn't quite name, the words rattled him. Maybe because no one else had ever looked at him long enough to notice something like that. The recognition between them wasn't just about names or blood. It was about the pieces of themselves that had survived the years, even when everything else had been stripped away. Rafe looked ahead at the empty road and felt something he hadn't in years. The possibility that he wasn't too far gone to turn around. By mid-afternoon, the sun was a white disk in a washed-out sky, and the road had stretched into a long, unbroken line of dust and heat. The world felt wide open, but Rafe's chest was tight. He rode alongside Anna's wagon in silence, but inside it was anything but quiet. His instincts, the ones that had kept him alive all these years, were gnawing at him. They told him to keep moving, to cut ties before they turned into chains. The longer he stayed with her, the greater the chance someone would recognize him, remember the wanted posters, and turn his name into a bounty ticket. And yet, every time he thought about spurring Brim ahead and leaving her behind, something in him twisted. He stole a glance at her. She was focused on the mules, shoulders squared, veil fluttering faintly. The sight brought back flashes her sitting, cross-legged on the floor of their old cabin, braiding her hair before supper. The stubborn set of her jaw when she told him she'd learned to shoot Pa's old rifle just as well as he could. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had survived 10 years of roads and hard winters, but she was still his sister. That truth was simple. Everything else was not. He tried to picture himself riding away. He'd go back to what he knew: gambling halls, backroom deals, sleeping with one eye open. He could survive that way. He had. But the thought of doing it after seeing her again made his gut churn. It would be easier if she'd cursed him out, told him she never wanted to see him again. Then he could leave with the cold comfort of knowing she didn't care. But she hadn't done that. She'd sat there in her quiet, steady way, asking questions that dug deeper than he wanted to admit. He'd spent years telling himself he was too far gone to change. But now she was here, and the old excuses didn't feel as sturdy as they used. 2. The pass opened into a wide plain dotted with low brush. From this vantage, he could see the faint line of another road crossing theirs miles ahead. That would be his chance. Slip away at the fork, let her take the northern route to her settlement while he angled west. That was the smart play. But every time he imagined it, another picture took its place, her alone on the trail with no one to ride ahead and check the road, no one to make sure the next man who came upon her didn't mean her harm. He'd seen enough men like that in his life to know she'd meet them sooner or later. And then there was the darker thought, the one he didn't want to face, that maybe it wasn't just about protecting her. Maybe, after all this time, he didn't want to be alone anymore. He hated that thought. Loneliness was something you learned to live with out here. It kept you sharp. Depending on someone, needing someone made you soft. And soft men didn't last long. "You're thinking hard," Anna said suddenly, breaking into his spiral. Rafe blinked, caught off guard. "Am I?" "Your jaw does this thing when you're chewing on a problem," she said, eyes still on the road. "Always has." He huffed out a quiet laugh despite himself. "Guess I never noticed." "I did," she replied, and there was a warmth in her tone that unsettled him more than any pistol ever had. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he didn't know whether to stay or go, whether he could be the kind of man she needed him to be. But the words stuck. Saying them out loud would mean admitting he cared enough for it to matter. Instead, he said, "Road splits ahead in a few miles. You sure you'll be fine on your own from there?" Anna gave him a sideways look, the kind that could cut through any armor. If you have to ask, you already know the answer. He didn't respond. The plane stretched out before them, the fork in the road just a smudge on the horizon. His instinct screamed to take the westward path and vanish, just like he always did. But the pull to ride north. Her road was growing stronger by the minute, an ache he couldn't shake. Rafe wasn't used to feeling torn. Usually, the choice was simple. Take what you need, leave the rest. But now, the choice meant deciding what kind of man he wanted to be from here on out. And the worst part? He didn't know if he had it in him to change. The fork in the road was close now, so close Rafe could see the weathered signpost standing lonely against the sky. One arm of the post pointed west toward the mining towns, the places where he could disappear into noise and card tables. The other pointed north, toward the settlement Anna had spoken of, small, quiet, and the kind of place where a man like him would stand out in all the wrong ways. The sensible choice was clear. His hand drifted to the reins, ready to give Brim the signal to veer west. He could do it in a heartbeat, no words, no goodbyes. Anna would roll north, and he'd be gone before she looked back, but his eyes kept pulling toward her wagon. The mule's ears flicked in time with their steady pace, her posture upright and unyielding in the driver's seat. Even with the veil back in place, he could feel the weight of her presence, and in his mind, the scene played out, the one he'd been trying not to imagine. Another rider, not him, catching up to her on some empty stretch of road. A stranger with a hunger sharper than his own. No recognition, no hesitation. No reason to change his mind. Rafe's gut tightened. He told himself she was strong enough to handle herself. She'd made it this far alone, after all. But that wasn't the point. The point was, if she rode north without him, he'd be right back to where he'd been all these years, wondering if she'd survive the next day, the next week, the next man who decided she was worth taking from. He wasn't sure he could stomach that again. The signpost loomed closer. The west road opened up wide and inviting, the horizon shimmering with heat. The north road was narrower, winding through a stretch of sparse cottonwoods before dipping into a valley. "Here's your turn," Rafe said, his voice flat, like he hadn't already made up his mind. Anna glanced at him, then at the fork. "And yours?" He gave her a nod. "Guess so." The mules kept their pace, and for a heartbeat, it looked like they'd each take their separate paths without another word. But then Rafe felt his hand tighten on the reins, holding Brim steady. Wagon rolled a few yards ahead before Anna noticed he wasn't moving. She pulled up, dust settling around them. "You're not going?" she asked. Rafe shifted in the saddle, suddenly feeling like a boy caught standing on the wrong side of the schoolmaster's line. Not west, no. Her eyes narrowed slightly, beneath the brim of her hat. Why? He looked away toward the open plain, where the west road stretched like a promise he no longer wanted. Call it a change of plans. That's not an answer. He met her gaze then, and for the first time since he'd found her, he didn't try to hide anything. "Because I'm done running away from you." The words hung between them, heavier than he expected. Anna studied him for a long moment. "You think you can just ride north and, what, make up for everything?" "No," he said simply. "But I can ride north and make sure you get where you're going. After that, we'll see." Something in her expression softened, but only slightly. She gave a small shake of her head, like she still didn't know whether to believe him. "It's not an easy road." "I've never had one that was," he replied. A long silence stretched out before she flicked the reins. The mules stepped forward, turning onto the north road. Rafe nudged Brim to follow, falling into step beside her. The west road disappeared. Behind them, swallowed by the shimmering horizon. Ahead, the narrow trail wound toward the distant green of the valley, a sliver of life in the otherwise dry land. For the first time in years, Rafe wasn't thinking about where he could hide next, or how much food he had left. He was thinking about the road ahead, and about the woman in the wagon seat beside him, his sister, alive, and maybe the only person who could make him want to be more than what he'd become. It wasn't redemption. Not yet, but it was a start. The North Road felt different beneath the hooves and wheels, not in the way it looked, but in the way Rafe carried himself on it. Every mile they put between themselves and the fork was a mile he couldn't take back. And for the first time in years, that didn't feel like a trap. The sun was sliding westward, painting the valley ahead in shades of gold and copper. The cottonwoods rustled in the light breeze, their leaves flashing silver in the fading light. Somewhere far off, a hawk's cry cut through the quiet. Anna's wagon rolled steady, the mules pulling as if they'd been born to the rhythm. She didn't talk much, but she didn't have to. Every so often, she glanced sideways at him, like she was testing to see if he was still there. Each time, he was. Rafe found himself telling her small things, nothing about bounties or backroom deals, but stories about odd towns he'd passed through. A grizzled rancher who swore he could smell rain before clouds showed, a boy who once paid him in peaches for fixing a fence. She didn't always laugh, but sometimes her eyes crinkled in that way that used to mean she was trying not to smile. As dusk deepened, the valley opened wider, revealing a ribbon of river glinting under the sky. Beyond it, the faint glow of lanterns marked a settlement, her destination. "You'll like it there," Anna said finally. "People keep to themselves, but they'll share a roof or a meal if you need it." Rafe glanced toward the lights. "You think they'll take kindly to a man like me?" Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, not quite a warning. "Depends on the man you decide to be when you ride in." He let that hang in the air, tasting the truth in it. He'd been plenty of men over the years, gambler, drifter, outlaw, but maybe it was time to try one he hadn't worn before. As they crossed the shallow river, the wheels kicked up sprays of silver water, and the mules snorted at the chill. The lights ahead grew brighter, warm against the growing dark. For the first time since he put his hand to her veil and seen the truth beneath, Rafe felt the weight in his chest shift, not gone, but lighter. The road behind him had been long, and most of it he'd walked alone. The one ahead wasn't his alone to walk anymore. They rolled on toward the settlement, the night settling around them like a soft blanket. And for a man who'd built his life on leaving, Rafe realized he wasn't thinking about how to get out, he was wondering how to stay.